I would like to report something.
What would you like to report?
I'm getting stalked.
Welcome to Decoding TV's coverage of Baby Reindeer. If you're watching this on YouTube at youtube.com/@decodingtv, we are going to record this in two separate sections. We're talking about the first 4 episodes, and then there's going to be a separate section at the end of this video with the final episode's conversation. Patrick Klepek, Baby Reindeer is based off of a one-man show by Richard Gadd. All 7 episodes are available for Netflix. We've seen the first 4. So what did you think of Baby Reindeer? Should people watch this show based on the first 4 episodes? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. The one word of caution is maybe the wrong way to phrase it, but it's much more than what it appears to be. It is more than a show about a guy with a weird, eccentric stalker. I think it's a much more beautiful and interesting show because of it. But it's more than what the trailer, what some of the marketing might suggest of a quirky little guy being followed by a quirky little woman. But it makes it, I think it elevates the show to something much more interesting than I would have expected going into it.
Absolutely. I think the show is incredible. It's a part of this streaming era we live in where there can be a show that comes out of nowhere. Like, never heard of this show before it appeared as the #1 most watched show on Netflix. Never heard of the actor, never heard of the one-person show before, and then it is a massive sensation. And it's kind of like, oh, the streaming era has had many casualties and bad things about it, but one of the great things is something can come along just that you never heard of and then sweep the nation. Everyone's talking about it, everyone's engaging with it. This is one of those shows, and it is extremely well deserved. And I agree with Patrick Klepek that you think it's one thing and then it becomes something else, much more deep, much more interesting, much more compelling, and I would strongly recommend Baby Reindeer on Netflix. So let's talk about what actually happens in the show. Baby Reindeer begins in 2015 with a bartender and aspiring comedian named Donnie Dunn. One day he's working at the bar when a woman named Martha comes in, and Donnie takes pity on her, giving her a cup of tea for free. Martha claims to be a wealthy lawyer who's worked with some of the most famous people in the world, but many parts of her story don't really add up. Martha becomes obsessed with Donnie, bombarding him with dozens of emails per day, and generally being creepy and possessive. All right, Patrick Klepek. I mean, this is kind of the hook of the show.
Mm-hmm.
This woman becomes obsessed with this guy. Richard Gadd plays Donnie Dunn. Jessica Gunning plays Martha Scott. I think this is an incredible performance. Chilling, creepy, upsetting. What did you think of Jessica Gunning as Martha in this movie, in this show, I should say?
I mean, just captivating. Like, you can't look away from the performance, which it's a credit to the performance because it helps explain the increasingly poor choices that our main character makes or seems to make over the course of the first couple episodes, where you as the audience member are going, bro, what are we doing here? Like, see, like, you have options to get out of this, and yet you keep sinking yourself deeper and deeper into something that seems very off, very wrong. And it's a real testament to the performance that it's like, she's like this shiny object, and you just can't, you're annoyed by her, you're bothered by her, you're creeped out by her, and yet you can't look away. And that's a really difficult thing to pull off. I think it'd be something very easy to get wrong. And the balance between being charming and unnerving is something that she strikes remarkably well, and leads to a just really fascinating I don't know how to call what's called except chemistry between these two characters, despite the fact that the relationship suggests one that shouldn't be near one another at all.
There were so many parts of the show that made me want to shrivel up into a fetal position, or that made my soul want to exit my body.
Mm-hmm.
Just so many moments that are like super cringe. And the whole time I'm watching this show, I am asking myself, why does this guy continue to encourage this woman? Right? Like, why does this guy continue to encourage this woman? And here's the thing, Patrick Klepek, I'm so used to rough and shoddy storytelling that I just thought maybe it's just like a poorly written character. Like maybe because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense why he didn't continue. Like,
and also 7 episodes of this. Like, even though they're like mostly on the shorter, like 25 to 30, but occasionally they go a little longer. Like, are we really like? Yeah, okay. You know, in the first episode or two, like I was like,
but is he going to continue to nurture her affection for him for like 7? Like that, it makes no sense. You know, so I'm watching this. I'm like, oh, this is horrible. I would never do this. I would never do that. I would never And then of course episode 4 hits and completely recontextualizes the entire show. But my experience of watching it was, oh wow, this is terrible. This is cringe, and also. Donnie is kind of a implausibly written character if he's going to continue to keep this woman in his life despite her actual threat to his physical self. And I should have trusted the show more, but I get we've seen.
I don't blame you for not trusting the show.
We've seen a lot of shows where like the answer, the solution is they just didn't put that much thought into it. Like
especially the show. Right, and especially for it being a show that kind of just organically became like. Look, when something, I'm sure you've experienced this before, something is like number 1 on Netflix, that doesn't necessarily tell me anything about whether I should watch the show. That is a combination of the massive user base. If anything, probably, I think maybe it should tell you to not watch the show.
I'd say very frequently it's bad. What is the number 1 on Netflix, right?
And so when I saw this was taking off the way it was, when I watched the trailer, my impulse was, I see why this is entertaining. I see why it's popular. I fail to see how this could sustain without like it's already in 1 or 2 episodes in, like breaking my sense of like reality and plausibility to the point where I just do not understand, other than like it's turning into a murder mystery by the end. Like, what are we doing for 7 episodes? Like, this just like that just doesn't seem like it's going to sustain itself. And then, you know, as you said, there's a real narrative turning point in episode 4 that recontextualizes basically everything we've seen up to this point in a good way. That can work. That can go terribly wrong. And I think here, part of what I would tell people about the show, if they're on the fence about it, is this is a show that you should trust. That whatever your initial feelings are on where this is going, how it can sustain this. I'm getting tired of constantly rolling my eyes at this guy when he declares, I shouldn't do this, and then does it. Like, eventually, there's going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back on that, where you as the viewer can no longer even go on a journey with this character. And it's only going to rely on how entertaining like the implausibility is. This is a show that starts implausible and then becomes upsettingly plausible, I guess is the best way to characterize it without spoiling where it goes. But like, it's tough. I hate characterizing it as a spoiler. I hate talking about it as a twist. It's more that I want to contextualize it as trust the show's storytelling. More than, because it is true that events occur that recontextualize, but this is not an M. Night Shyamalan situation. This isn't something like that. It is more a lack of information about a character informs in a really interesting way why a character would act the way that they did.
Yeah, I mean, let's get to it pretty quickly here. I mean, in another episode, we learned Donnie has secretly started dating Terry, a trans woman, but he's been concealing his true identity from Terry, and he hasn't shared about Terry with anyone in his own life. Eventually, things come to a head as Donnie can't bring himself to kiss Terry in public.
I gotta say, the introduction of this character in that arc, I was sweating the entire time. I'm like, this is such a delicate thing. Like, you're really gonna introduce a character that's like dealing with like their internalized like transphobia. Like, I was like, like, I hope this show can like operate on these different levels.
I felt the same way. I was like, what? And the way it comes about feels very orthogonal to what the show is doing until that point, you know, because it's like, oh, I thought this was a stalker show, and then it's like, okay, now this guy has this other love interest, and she's a trans woman, and also he's using a different identity. So like, why are we even learning about this character? Like, what's going on? You know?
Yeah.
And then so I'm like, okay, show, interesting. Where is this going? Martha continues to infiltrate Donnie's life, befriending his landlady Liz under a different identity. Turns out that Martha is actually a stalker who has spent time in actual jail. Martha, Terry, and Donnie all converge on one of Donnie's stand-up performances, and things end up coming to blows. all of Donnie's stand-up performances are incredible. They're just, I mean, actual physical pain watching them. It's exquisite. You know, there's a term I've heard used, like an ecstasy of pain. That's kind of how I feel watching Donnie's stand-up performances. They're all uniformly bad, and even when they're not bad, something bad happens during them. You know, like I thought they were just wonderful in that way.
Have you? I know you're a big appreciator of comedy. I know most of what you watch. I don't know if most of what you watch are like the specials and like stuff that's aired where comedians are mostly working through kind of like finished material. When Katie and I, my wife and I lived in LA, we had a chance to go to the Upright Citizens Brigade that was near like the Scientology building. UCB defined my sense of comedy in high school. That Comedy Central 3-season show is like some of my favorite comedy of all time. And so when I lived there, like the idea that I could go see people like Matt Besser and others in person was like a dream come true. Yeah. And so we got occasionally there's like the shows on like Saturday night. It was called ASCAP, and they wouldn't announce who was showing up. And sometimes you would get the way ASCAP worked was like a comedian or an actor would come through and they would tell a story. They would tell some jokes, and then a bunch of improv artists would then do skits based on that. And sometimes you'd have comedians come through. Like one time, Aziz Ansari came through, and
sorry,
thank you. And he started off by saying, "Hey, I'm working on material. It's okay if you don't laugh." Like, and he's like, "By the way, I'm going to tell a joke, and then we're going to get really uncomfortable for a couple minutes because I'm going to spend a couple minutes taking notes on the joke." He's like, "Because you're here and you only paid $5 for this show."
Right,
he's like, "This is for the tour that I'm doing." He's like, "But I'm using you to work on this material, and it's okay that it's uncomfortable, and it's okay to not laugh." And so there'd be like bits where he'd like go halfway through a joke, and he's like, "Well, that's not really working," and he would stop and like take notes on it. It was just a very fascinating room to be in. And so watching, like, part of what I think what is really fascinating about these sections of the episodes, it really reminded me of like so much of what most people's exposure to a lot of art, right? But comedy especially, are like kind of finished products. But like the journey to making something funny or interesting, like the rough draft process, is fucking excruciating and usually involves being very bad for a very long time until you can figure out something interesting to say.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is Donnie Dunn should have just been much more clear about his creative process, and that would have solved everything. He'd have been like, "Hey, this might be bad." So, that's one of the special things about stand-up comedy is you, as the audience, you are often part. If you're not in the crowd work, you're often part of the actual creative process of helping somebody refine their jokes. There's not really a medium that works like that. Yes, there's test screenings in movies, but like then you put the movie out, and then it's and that is the way it is.
It's not in real time, like in the way that it's fascinating in that regard.
By the way, my wife and I watched the first 4 episodes of Baby Reindeer together, and she said Terry, the trans woman, is supposed to be a therapist as well, I believe, right? And I'm just gonna, I don't want to judge, but based on her actions, doesn't seem like the greatest therapist. I'm gonna put that out there. Like, I don't know about her ability to diffuse and de-escalate, based on what we've seen of that character. In episode 4, we flash back to Donnie's time as someone trying to make it big in Edinburgh. I think it was the Edinburgh Fringe Festival.
I believe so, yeah.
Which is like a huge deal. Like it's one of the premier festivals of its kind in the world. In a chance encounter, he meets Darian, a successful television writer who starts grooming him with drugs and the promise of career mentorship. We witness how Darian ends up violently assaulting Donnie, and how Donnie is psychologically scarred by the entire process, questioning his sexuality, and ultimately leading him to the place where he is, to some degree, taking steps to keep Martha, his stalker, in his life. So that is what happens in episode 4. Obviously, we're going to be discussing this plot point and sexual assault a little bit in this upcoming segment, so just letting you know in case that's something you want to be aware of. But this episode was a massive emotional gut punch. Patrick Klepek. It's extremely well executed, I thought. Not even just from a script perspective, from an acting perspective, but just from a like in terms of the cinematography, just like drawing you into this world where like a lot of close-up shots on Donnie's face where you're experiencing his horror at the situation, his anguish, his physical pain. Totally harrowing and upsetting. What was your reaction, Patrick Klepek?
Well, it's fascinating to have had that conversation about the sympathizer, and the way it chooses to depict the film within a TV show depicting sexual assault, and then here, which as part of the storytelling, like some really upsetting events are about to occur, and yet it seems to have been shot, scripted, acted, the whole thing executed with a unbelievable degree of empathy for the events that are transpiring, in which you feel for the principal character involved, and yet it doesn't feel exploitative. And that is a really difficult line to walk. You forwarded me a piece in The Guardian in which there was a creative consultant on the show that like specifically helped in developing and sculpting this episode to achieve that.
Let me read a little bit from that, if I may. So this is from Jeffrey Ingold, who wrote an article at The Guardian called "Baby Reindeer Strikes a Painful Chord for Gay and Bi Men, and I Know Why. Grooming and Rape Are Common." And he writes in the article that he was the LGBTQ plus consultant for 2 years on Baby Reindeer. And he wrote, quote, "Baby Reindeer's depiction of grooming and rape is as significant as it is unflinching. So few mainstream TV shows dare to explore the traumatic and destabilizing impact of sexual assault on gay and bi men. There is a hidden epidemic of sexual violence within the queer community that is rarely visible in media. It's hard to know the scale of the problem when, understandably, very few gay and bi survivors report their experiences to the police, and we know that almost a third of those who do feel as if they were not taken seriously by officers. This leaves survivors soaked in shame and silence. For shows that want to authentically tackle naughty and taboo issues, Baby Reindeer shows how vital it is to enlist the expertise of external consultants to shape storylines and character arcs to accurately reflect real-life experiences." End quote. Anyway, it's a powerful article, and I just wanted to mention it before we went any further. But go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, and I that article is like you said is well worth reading, especially if you want some insight into the sort of creative process for depicting such a delicate situation. But yeah, I'm with you 100% on this is not where I sort of expected the show to go. It it all of a sudden creates an enormous amount of like depth for this character, like this characterization for everything watched to this point. And I just found like all the scenes where this really upsetting actions are depicted on screen felt like they were done with a lot of care, and that is just not usually like it's obviously violently upsetting to watch, but to also feel like it was done with care for the events is an interesting dynamic, not one that you usually see when such events are depicted in television or film.
I think for me, I went on multiple journeys during this episode. One of the journeys is, well, first of all, as we discussed, often sexual assault is used as a quote unquote interesting backstory for a character on screen, but it's never really explored. Right.
Or shock, right? Shock value.
Value. But that's right. But it's never really explored. And that's the problem with it is like, for many people, being assaulted in this way can be the defining event of their life. And everything afterwards is shaped by that event, as it was in this character's life. And this episode shows why that is the case. This episode shows how this event led this character down this very dark path, this very confusing path where they didn't understand themselves, whether they felt responsible for what happened, what their own sexuality was, and how that can all be mixed up in feelings and emotions, both positive and negative, which I'm sure creates its own form of guilt. So there's that component of it, and there's also this component of it too, where I felt like the show was calling me out, not in a bad way, I watched this guy, Donnie Dunn, kind of nurture this stalker character, right? Like, not cut the stalker character out of her life, like friend her on Facebook, take pity on her when she looked pathetic, and all these things that I'm like, you should not be doing this with a stalker that might hurt you. And I'm like, I'm judging this guy. I'm like, I judge you, Donnie Dunn, as a character. Then I watch episode 4, and it's like, oh, like holy shit, like people are going through shit you just have no idea what they're, like that's just true in real life. And I'm much less likely, in my opinion, to judge someone in real life because I know that in real life. But this show illustrates people are just going through stuff you have no idea what it is. Like you have no idea what their backstory is, what led them to this point. And before you assume it's just a badly written character, pause and take a step back, and wonder to yourself, maybe there's something more complicated going on here. And in this case of this show, I think there is. So just a tremendous episode that like made me rethink how I should judge characters on screen. How I should view characters on screen that are going through complicated issues. So
right, and even just it's the actions of everybody involved, right? Like I mean, like you see, in this episode 4, you see the beginning of Donnie's inability to kind of say no to things, like to get him like, and like it recontextualizes like whole other scenes where our introduction to why he broke up with Keely, like in the first place, like oh well, she called me emotionally stunted, and then I moved in with her mom, like da 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 da, and
right, and I'm like, oh, you kind of fast forwarded through that real quick, but hey, whatever, maybe the show's just taking shortcuts,
Shortcuts. It's also the way we tell stories about our lives to other people, like what are we willing to share with other people, and what is underneath all that? What are we even consciously aware of how our actions are informed? But, I think part of the kind of genius structure of the storytelling is that it's the way you usually get an episode like this is the show is hiding information from you. And that's why it becomes a twist. Like the show is deliberately not showed you things that it could have showed you before. But now we're going to show it to you in like a flashback or something like that. And wow, like if now I understand like why else is happening. The way maybe Reindeer contextualizes it is the character in the story is not realizing their own actions until they realize it's a direct consequence of the trauma they've gone through. So the reason we even have a flashback is because the character in that moment, as they go to the police station, to report Martha, is realizing, holy shit, the entire reason I'm here is because of the repressed trauma in my life. And so it's really, it's
you're realizing it. You're realizing it along with the character, and there's like a almost like a plot driven reason why this is the point at which you're being given the information.
I'd call it clever, if not for the fact that like that feels a little reductive, given that it's pulling from real life events, but it feels organic and natural. And that's why it hits a lot harder, because you've gone on this journey with the character. They're having the realization alongside the audience. And so that's why it's why I'm so cautious about like calling it a
twist, right?
And this just feels
you don't
like
want to cheapen it. You don't want to cheapen it by calling it a twist.
Right. And because that's not what this is. And it really feels like you've gone on a journey with the character. They're realizing it with you. And that is just, it leads to exquisite storytelling.
It created so much empathy for me with the main character, because when he it's such an incredible moment watching it, like everything that you've seen until now, like locking into place for why things are the way they are, and what it is that Martha provides him, which is like a very simplistic notion of masculinity. Basically, like he is questioning his own masculinity, his sexuality, and here comes this woman who's like, it's very simple. She really likes him. She's sexually attracted to him, and it's like, and gives him the positive reinforcement that he needs at this moment in his life. And it's like, oh yeah, it all makes it. You understand why someone would need that, and what this character provides, this Martha character provides. I have to say, the most upsetting thing about Martha is that she writes "sent from my iPhone" for
and writes it every
for emails that
time.
Are not sent from an iPhone. Like, of all the things to be duplicitous about.
Also, Martha, we've dropped it as a cultural marker a long time ago. Like nobody's. It used to be because you were bragging because you were buying an expensive device.
Right.
Now, come
right.
on,
now it's actually, now people actually look down on it.
Yes. Now it's very tacky to do that.
Yes, it's like it's like I have put less thought into this email than usual. Yeah. Anyway. All right, Patrick Klepek, any other thoughts? I was wondering, overall, I think the Martha stuff, there's all these like nice little touches, like the misspellings, like the user. Like, there's all these things that if you encounter them in real life, it would feel super off to you. You know, the username that has like 18 characters in it and 18 numbers and letters in it, and you know, the sent from my iPhone, and the on her phone she has like all these famous people on her contact list that are probably fake numbers. You know, like
Yes.
just all this like stuff that's just like, oh, that's just, it's the red flags are flying left and right in this thing. You know, so anything else you want to mention? Any other touches to the show that you want to mention?
So we've only watched the first 4. There are 3 left. I'm like just so curious with like the tonal shit. Like, what's the rest of this show? What after all of this happens in 4, you know, it's a very funny show. Even that as upsetting as it gets at the end of 4. Like, so where does this show go for the rest of its run? Like, that's what I think you and I've watched a number of shows. We've been very lucky over the course of this year where at multiple points you and I are like, where's this going? You know, like, and I don't know where the show is going. And that's especially so because of this pivot. Like, I feel like when I watched the first 2 episodes, like, all right, this is really entertaining. Like, I guess I can see where I mean, I know the specific events, but like, I sort of see the escalation of where this show is going. And the moment it introduced like his complicated relationship with like, you know, dating a trans character, like the nature of his sexuality and how he's exploring or not. I mean, it's such a different show than where it started. And for it to have done that over the course of 4 roughly 30-minute episodes is tremendous. It makes me deeply curious where it ends up. But at this point, I have full faith. To feel like you're in such strong creative hands is exciting to know that I don't know where this is going, but we made it this far and it's been this good and this interesting and this sensitive. I'm fascinated to see where it ends up.
Rank impressions, baby reindeer. Baseless lies and slander.
What was that?
Patrick Klepek and I have now seen the final 3 episodes of the show. We're going to talk about and spoil those final 3 episodes. But I guess, Patrick Klepek, let's start with like overall thoughts. Like, do you think people should watch this show? Do you think it sticks the landing? Like, is it a worthwhile journey for you?
Yes, I think we have just borne witness to. I don't want to overstate it, but I'm going to overstate it. Like in the last decade, like one of the most important works of art about trauma, identity, sexuality, while also being one of the most irresponsible.
Yes, very true.
Very true. Somehow I we'll get into that.
Yeah,
but I'm going to put aside the second part for a minute. I think it's a landmark work. I think it is like just an unbelievable achievement about, like I said, trauma, identity, sexuality. I'm in awe at so much of it. And I think that will end up outlasting some very real mistakes that were made in regards to its production, its depiction of reality, non-reality. I think that will outlive it for better or for worse, because the 7-episode run is just really one of the most incredible things I've seen in the past 10 years. And I think I'll be thinking about it for a very long time.
I also agree it's worth watching. I thought that there were some weaknesses in the second half that, like, I don't know if it's quite at the level that you're mentioning it for me, but I also thought it was very strong. And certainly if you've watched the first half, it's definitely worth finishing the show. There's a lot to recommend it. And it is a wild journey, and it does have a lot to say. And I think a lot of what it has to say is worthwhile. Now, as Patrick alluded to, there's a bunch of real life stuff tied up with what's going on. We will be covering those in a bonus episode. And so we'll try to talk about the show just as a show, but know that we are very aware of all the stuff around the real life characters or real life people that the show is based off of. And we will be discussing that at a separate time. But let's talk about what actually happens in these episodes. In the final half of the season, Martha ups the ante by assaulting Donnie's ex-girlfriend Keely on the street and continuing to harass Donnie at work. This causes Donnie to move out of Keely's house, and he moves in with these people who party all the time. Donnie spends more time with his girlfriend Terry. they kind of try to retreat from everything, but he's unable to be physically intimate with her due to his own trauma. Eventually, the relationship ends, partially because Donnie is unable to fully break things off with Martha. Let's just pause for a moment about talk about this Terry relationship. I thought this was really like a strong, haunting depiction of this relationship. He got a second chance with Terry, and that was nice. And he kind of blew it, and Terry read the situation correctly, which is that Donnie wasn't willing to let go of what Martha was giving him, and it was creating all these problems in their lives, and eventually Terry couldn't stand it anymore. Honestly, Terry put up with it for far longer than I think most people should have to put up with anything like that. What do you think of the Donnie Terry relationship?
I think it was really wonderful and nuanced, and doesn't use the character of Terry as like a convenient plot prop. I think Terry is given like a lot of full realization and nuance as it's why I was so worried when a character like Terry was introduced. Like, this show is, already juggling a lot of really sensitive topics to then also include a character's relationship to transness and how their masculinity is tied up. And I was like, what? You're just adding to a pile that was already pretty delicate. And I think the show, obviously I can't speak from the trans experience, but I think like I thought it did a really worthwhile job of making that relationship feel whole and meaningful and nuanced. And we talked earlier about, Terry's introduced as a character who is a therapist. And it's like, wow, I'm not sure you're deploying this makes me worried about you as a therapist. If, this is how you're acting in some other situations, but the way she reads their relationship and just how on the nose and correct and encapsulating it is of Donnie, and how he has allowed this Martha situation to go on. I thought it was like really upsetting and sad, given that we get this really enjoyable montage of like their relationship finally clicking and everyone being happy, and then the way it crashes, how quickly it crashes. I thought it was really beautiful. And the way that it just sort of ends, it has consequences, ripple effects for what Donnie does next, but it's not as though that character is dangled out as something for him to get as a reward for his redemption arc, for his understanding. Right. Like, it is, it feels much more realistic to what would happen. Obviously it's based in real life, but like it feels like
in real life, you usually get a second chance with someone, and then if you blow the second chance, it's over.
Yeah,
right? Like, just like in reality.
Just because he cry on stage and it goes viral does not mean the person comes running in when it's raining, saying like, "I love you, I understand you now because of your trauma." It's life is not that cinematic. And I think it's the way that this relationship feels. It feels realistic. For the short amount of time the show has for any of its runtime, being 30-minute episodes, only 7 episodes. I feel like it gives the character and their relationship the time that it deserves.
Martha begins harassing Donnie's parents. We meet his parents and see what they're going through. And at one point, Donnie brings up Martha's former stalking charges to Martha herself, sending her into a rage. She smashes a glass into his face, but because his place of work doesn't want him to report it, he decides to stay away from it. Later, which I thought was like, that was actually a pretty gut-wrenching part of the show, where you kind of understand how he could be talked into not reporting it to the police.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of economic insecurity, ultimately the cause of a lot of problems. Later, at a comedy competition, he confesses the entirety of his inner life and all the events that have happened thus far to a bunch of strangers in the audience. Patrick Klepek, we got to talk about this scene. On the one hand, amazing performance, and also really like evocative performance. Like, the whole time I'm cringing. I'm wondering what the audience is experiencing at this time. I'm wondering what the guy who's organizing the competition is experiencing this time. I'm worried about who's going on after Donnie. Like, how is that going to play out? On the other hand, some people whose opinion I value brought this up to me, that one huge weakness is he doesn't actually communicate any really new information in this monologue. The new information is his act of saying it to people and like acknowledging it for himself. But yeah, it's very, very long, and it's just kind of like laying out a lot of stuff that I think we already knew. Patrick Klepek, did you recognize that as a shortcoming, or were you kind of like all in on this? What do you think?
I don't disagree with that assertion, but I felt like the summary, the timeline events is important for. I can certainly see maybe it didn't have the scene it goes on
Yeah,
excruciatingly long. Like
yeah,
they really make you sit with the awkwardness
yeah.
of what's happening and eliminate any sort of sense that there might be an out, which is like, oh, well, maybe as he talks about his trauma, he'll crack a joke, which will get a laugh. And then he's going to, oh, this is how this whole thing is going to happen. Like, this is going to turn into a comedy set by the end. And he'll have worked. Like, this is how, like, no, it's actually just sad, dark, upsetting, long, and mostly quiet. And I don't know. I took it as an important moment for the character where they're, in many ways, this is not a character that's ever gone through therapy. This is not a character that's
Hmm.
ever had seemingly a meaningful conversation with another person in their life, nor in their head about the timeline of events. And so I think, given the story structure of Baby Reindeer as a whole, where it feels like over and over the show has put us in the same place as the character, I found that to be consistent with, yes, it comes across as a bit of a Wikipedia summary of like the show so far, but in many ways, like this is a character who has refused to engage with a Wikipedia summary of their life and how all these events are connected. Even when their relationship just crumbled, as someone pointed out, how his trauma is connected to how he's treating others in his relationship, it still hadn't landed. And so I found it to be very moving and interesting to have it all laid out, because I think it felt like it was important to the character to arrive at that moment, to walk through the entire timeline events, and to realize over the course of your life, lots of seemingly not connected things happen. And then the further distance you get from those events, you start to realize how much they truly are connected, even if you can't realize it in the moment. And so it worked for me and where the character was at, but I can certainly understand, from a plot perspective, it's just repeating things. From a length perspective, it does drag a
Yeah,
bit.
yeah.
But I felt it was consistent in the storytelling of Baby Reindeer up until that point.
I think just in general, I'm impressed when, uh, or not necessarily impressed, but I appreciate how storytellers handle exposition. When they
Mm-hmm.
need to communicate, oh, here's a character communicating to another character stuff you already know. Like how they handle that, I think can be really interesting. And this was fine. Like the performance is excellent, but it's there's very little new insight in that specific monologue. But as you said, very well performed. All your points are very well taken, Patrick Klepek, on that point. Do you have some stuff that you make more sense of looking back, than that are connected? I'm kind of intrigued by that point that you made. Like,
I mean, like it's less like trauma related as much as it's like, especially now that I've got kids, I think back to a lot of like my relationship with my parents, how they handled parenting, how I viewed
mhm.
that as a child, how I now increasingly agree with many things that my parents did like it's just like in
Right.
the web of your life, so much of it more is like you can make so much more sense of it as time goes on. And so I found a lot of interest in watching that monologue from the sense of like, you can't appreciate your life's journey till you get to a certain point where you can look back on it. And I think most of us, if we're lucky, do not have a life's journey that is nearly as traumatic as the one that our main character in Baby Reindeer has gone through. But we all have our individual traumas and ups and downs. And
Yeah.
I guess that's the part that I found like deeply relatable, was the sense of like, you do have moments in life where things sort of click into place, and you can sort of see the spider web and how it travels backwards in a way that you just cannot appreciate in the moment.
This is unrelated to Baby Reindeer at all. So I'm not
Mm-hmm.
comparing this situation to anything with Baby Reindeer, but I did see a post. I think it was a post on Blue Sky recently about how You will never know how much worse luck your bad luck saved you from. I thought that was good. And I was just telling you, there was a job that I applied for a couple years ago that I really, really, really wanted. I was like super psyched about this job. I was, I was one of the final candidates for this role, and I didn't get it, and it was crushing. Like it took me like weeks to get over it, and I'm not going to get into details, but I'll say that based on how things have played out, uh, my life is better now that I'm not in that role, if that makes sense.
No,
You know?
I mean, when I was fired last year from Vice, I mean, I was a complete, it's not a job where I was fired and then had jobs lining up. I had like a lot of well wishes. And like, well, that sucks, man. Cool. Usually that's followed up with like
people
hey,
are posting, hire this person, and it's like,
that's not turning. I mean, dead serious. Like multiple people that I've worked with for decades, who are the kind of people that when I'm in between things, like, hey man, that sucks. Let me go talk to HR and like we'll see if we can figure something out. It was just that sucks, and I was like, wow, I don't.
No, not even a perfunctory. I'll look into something.
No, not at all. There was nothing. Like there was nothing on the other side of this firing, and things. A year later, I'm making more money than I was before. I'm in a more stable position than I was before. But that's like not how I felt as like
you're co-hosting the prestigious Decoding TV podcast.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. None of this none of this stuff happens unless I'm fired from my job, and I'm thinking about this as I'm like, you should stop crying while you're going to the daycare to pick up your kids. Like you should need this is suppress. But you just it's the same. Yeah, I don't that bad luck. Like I don't know if I had been, but the thing is, if I had been laid off a year earlier, I probably do get a job somewhere,
right?
In which I am in a
which
worse
you get
position.
Laid off a year later,
or like if I'm laid off 6 months earlier, like things just sort of fell into place for me to be in a good position, and I feel very fortunate for that. But that post is very much aligned with how I feel about it. It's like, wow, like that was bad luck. Well, there could have been a lot worse luck.
Right.
And how my job could have played out.
And it's this idea that you can't make sense of your own life. You can't like tell the story of your life until you're past it,
Right.
And seeing this character, Donnie, like put that together there is some value in that, right? Seeing him assemble the story of his life in one cohesive narrative. Which you're seeing on stage and also in the show itself.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, back to the story of Baby Reindeer. In the final episode, Donnie's performance goes viral and his career begins taking off, but Martha gets a hold of his phone number and starts to leave hundreds of voicemails, many of them threatening. Eventually, Donnie's able to get Martha arrested and sent to prison. Donnie also visits Darian, but does not confront him about the assault. When Darian offers him a writing job, Donnie accepts, but then has a panic attack and needs to listen to recordings of Martha's voicemails to soothe himself. In the final scene of the show, Donnie's having a drink at the pub and doesn't have his wallet. The bartender gives it to him for free in a reflection of the opening scene of the show. One of the weaknesses I think about this series is Donnie's career is kind of hand-waved off, really. Like, he's been working for years to become famous, and then he finally gets it, and then it's just kind of like, oh, I didn't want it after all. And that's it. It's like just dismissed offhand. That was a little bit disappointing, I think, how he dealt with that and the reaction to it. But then, Martha is arrested. There's this whole thing where he tries to entrap Martha by soliciting a sex act email from her, only to discover that she actually records everything. And that was like a great moment when he like realizes, I've really stepped in it at this point. And one of the great things about the show is you really get a sense of how difficult it is for the police to actually deal with these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I think the police in general are operating under laws that they're in this regard. I'm not talking about other things. I'm just talking about in regard to stalking. There are like some pretty harsh limits on what they are able to do. And if there's no actual physical threat or bodily harm or whatever, there's very little they can do, and then usually it's only until something horrible happens that like intervention can take place. And that's like really unfortunate weakness of the system we have, and you kind of get a sense of it as he brushes up against the justice system in the show. But any thoughts on these final sequence of events, Patrick?
I will say the ending of the show rubbed me the wrong way. I think Baby Reindeer presents a simplistic narrative that there is a skeleton key that unlocks the narrative to your life that gives you an understanding of how the events in your life are all connected. And man, that's just not so. Like, life is just not that simple, and I don't think it's
right because he's listening to hear like what is the origin of Martha's trauma. He's
right.
like, and he finds it, and it's like this baby reindeer that she held while her parents were fighting or whatever, and it's like, oh, that's why she's all messed up, like, and then aha, eureka, and then series cut to credits, it's like, yeah, not really, yeah,
right. And I think I think if you watch the entirety of the show, even if how Donnie arrives at an understanding of his life and his trauma is sort of condensed and a little simplified for storytelling purposes, like it feels genuine and moving, and I'm able to excuse some of the simplicity for what it's trying to say and what it's trying to accomplish. The part that I just never get there with the show is that final moment where the baby reindeer thing is treated like a plot twist, and it suggests that, well, Donnie did this, and the if we just paid more attention to the people in our lives that are struggling, like even the ones that we cast away as the weirdos, like there's probably something in their history where something went wrong. And if we just knew what that was, we could understand them. And I think the show suggests we could fix them. And
right.
That just hand waves away mental illness. Like, just life is just so much, people are just so much more complicated than that.
Agreed. Yeah.
And it left it doesn't, in the same way that the show's complexities in regards to how it treats the reality of the people who are depicted in the show as characters, that all that stuff leaves a bad taste in my mouth. It doesn't ruin the show for me, but that in particular left a pretty bad taste in my mouth for a show that is otherwise pretty smart about how it's depicting sort of a personal therapeutic process and how we come to understand the connected parts of our lives and the story that it tells about our actions, past, present, and future. And the idea that it'd be one thing if the show came down and it said, and this is bad, like Donnie shouldn't be doing, because in many times the show is saying like Donnie's obsession is connected up in his previous trauma, his obsession over Martha, using Martha and the trauma from Martha as a coping mechanism away from, like, all that works. But then somehow the show ends with like a really disingenuous, distasteful, misleading, I think, view on the complexities of the human condition. That, now that I'm saying it here, is like, does that unravel all the things that I like about the show? I don't think so. But I don't like how it ends at all. In a way that I found really frustrating.
Okay. I actually agree with pretty much everything you just said. I think that there are some things the show does really well. I think his meeting with Darian is like really well done and haunting, because the idea is that he goes back to Darian and Darian says, "Oh, I saw your video. I thought it was very brave." It's just like,
oh my God.
How do you even talk about that? Like, Darian knows it's about him, but that guy has clearly compartmentalized the monstrous part of himself, like, and it's chilling the way he talks about it. And then even when it's brought up and put on the table, like, Donnie still can't talk about it. Like, he cannot confront Darian about it. And when Darian offers him a job, he's like, "Yeah, that sounds awesome." Like, that's a complex depiction of what that person would feel in that scenario. It's like, we want, like, as the viewer, we want him to storm into his house and confront him and maybe, beat him with a baseball bat or something, or do something bad to Darian because Darian's such a horrible person.
Scream at him. Like,
scream
throw
at him,
it all
something
on his face. It's not how abuse works.
Right, but it's not how it works. And I thought that was a very, like, nuanced depiction of how that might play. And then afterwards, he gets really sick, right? And then he soothes himself with the Martha recordings, which is kind of like, okay, what is it trying to say about that? Like, maybe just that in the most charitable way I'd react to that is that it's harder for Donnie to extricate himself from the Martha thing than he would like. But then you're right. It ends with this whole, aha, I figured it out. Now I understand the key to everything. That's kind of like, that's not really.
If it literally was just, I loved the poetic nature of somebody showing him kindness when he didn't have his wallet and was just like if we just didn't have the baby reindeer explanation, I think the ending works. So, because I buy him listening to the Martha record, like I understand, like all of that fits within the picture of how Martha and her flattery like turned into a cope. Like, oh, I'm on board. Show like I'm with you. It was just the idea that he stumbles into the one recording that helps explain why she is the way she is. That's the if he just deleted that part out, I think the ending thematically lands much stronger than the kind of muddled message it leaves about, because it doesn't say anything about Donnie. It feels like that is something that's being said to the audience, and I just don't think it was clear enough about like what it was trying to say in that.
Let's put aside the baby reindeer stuff.
Sure.
Let's put aside the skeleton key to unlocking the personality. Just the ending itself, just the final shot, and he's there in the bar, and the bartender takes kindness on him. What do you think that means? The first thing that came to mind immediately for me was, there, but for the grace of God go I. Like anyone can find themselves in a situation where they're in a really mentally unstable place, and then latch on to the first act of kindness that they see. And maybe Martha and I are not so different after all. Like that was my initial surface reading. But Patrick, did you have any thoughts on why they decided to end that way?
My reading of it was that his mistake was not showing kindness to Martha in the moment. Like for everything that happened after, for all the mistakes he made along the way, recognizing that someone was going through a moment and offering them just a small act of acknowledgement and kindness, like the world could use more of that. And like that is something that like the world should embrace, and that is a good approach to have to people, strangers you meet in your life, is to show a little kindness.
In 99.9% of cases, it's a good thing, and the thing that happened at the end of the show is an example of it being one of those 99.9% of cases, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that was the sense I got from the show, was like it's full circle, but what happens next is not going to be that. It will just be Donnie in a moment where he's seen sobbing at the counter is someone going like, that person's having a fuck it, like I'm just going to let them have a moment to collect themselves, and hopefully they'll feel better on the other side. And to do that to more strangers that you find in a situation like that, I think that's the message the show is communicating. That's the message that landed with me. And that's what made me so frustrated with the final recording. Be like, okay, like you had the message, like maybe it's a little cheesy, but it's a message, and it lands thematically with the rest of the show. Whereas the final recording, I don't know, just it feels like the show being indulgent to itself.
Yeah, that's interesting. I obviously had kind of a different reading, and because this is realization of like, oh, I am the Martha of this situation, right? I am the Martha of this situation, and I think that moment of realization at the end is like there's a thin line separating me and the Marthas of this world. That was my interpretation of it. But hey, curious what people thought of the ending of the show. Let us know what you think. What was your interpretation of the final shots? This is why I love talking about this kind of stuff on these podcasts, Patrick, is like we can dive into the endings and talk in detail about what we think about it. And I'm curious what people think. decodingtv@gmail.com. Let us know. Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.